Multiple sclerosis symptoms. So as a result of the inflammatory process in the central nervous system, people with MS can experience any or all of the following symptoms. This isn't an exhaustive list of symptoms, it's just some of the more typical ones. And remember, you may never experience any of these symptoms, because everybody's different. Or if you have these, you may have them at some time or not have them at another time. Fatigue. Fatigue is the most common symptom in multiple sclerosis. Tingling, numbness, pain, painful sensations, discomfort. Blurred or double vision, optic neuritis. Some muscle weakness, impaired balance and coordination, changes in bladder, bowel, or sexual function, cognitive impairment such as forgetfulness, speech impairment or difficulty swallowing, depression and mood swings can all be multiple sclerosis symptoms. Because they are symptoms, remember, this doesn't necessarily mean you will ever experience these symptoms. These are just some of the more common ones. There are currently 4 types of MS that are being recognized: relapsing remitting, secondary progressive, primary progressive, and progressive relapsing. Relapsing remitting is the most common form of MS, and it is also the most common way people are diagnosed. People are often first diagnosed with relapsing remitting MS. It's characterized by relapses, flares, or exacerbations. They're all the same thing, different names for the same thing. These relapses or flares are usually followed by partial or complete recovery period, known as remission, during which symptoms improve or may be completely absent. And with relapsing remitting, there's no apparent worsening or progression of the disease, although symptoms can be worse at different times. And at any time, a symptom can appear or not be present. The second type is secondary progressive. This follows an initial period of people being diagnosed with relapsing remitting and experiencing relapsing remitting MS. With secondary progressive, the disease begins to worsen more steadily. There may or may not be relapses. There may be slight remissions or plateaus. But with secondary progressive, often, not always, there isn't a return to a complete absence of symptoms, as there was with relapsing remitting. Primary progressive MS is characterized by steady worsening of neurologic functioning. Primary progressive MS does not have distinct relapses or period of remission. And usually if people are diagnosed with primary progressive MS, they're diagnosed with that initially, not always. but that would be an initial diagnosis. People's rate of progression may vary over time, and there can be occasional plateaus or temporary improvements. Some people with primary progressive MS or diagnosed with primary progressive MS, the progression is very slow. With others, it can be quite rapid. Progressive relapsing MS. This is the least common disease course. And until recently, it wasn't given a separate category. It is characterized by steadily worsening disease from the very beginning, from the beginning of diagnosis, similar to primary progressive MS. But there are occasional relapses along the way. So there may be times where there's some remitting, but the disease continues to progress. There is a lot more information that you can gain about MS. And the National MS Society, both the national chapter and the Northern California chapter, have this information for you. So I've given you some contact information. So, now that we've talked about MS, might be helpful to take a deep breath, maybe a couple, because it can be quite difficult to sit and listen and to hear about MS, MS symptoms, the types of MS. So notice that as you were listening to this, in this program that you're participating in so that it will lower your stress may have increased. And I will promise you that you will be learning tools to deal with the stress. And for the most part, participation in this program will be lowering your stress, not increasing your stress. So take a couple of deep breaths. And let's talk more about stress and MS. Let's leave behind the diagnosis of MS and talk about stress. There's no research indicating that stress causes MS or even contributes to the progression of MS. There is some evidence, and more is being gathered, that supports the association between stressful life events or chronic stress and relapses in MS or increase in MS symptoms. So let me repeat that. Stress and stressors don't cause MS and won't cause MS to progress as far as the research indicates up until this point. But there is some very strong evidence through research that supports the association between chronic stress or stressful life events and relapses or increase in MS symptoms. This was anecdotal for years, and it has only been relatively recently that the connection between stress and MS has been researched. What is well known in the research outside of MS and just research on how stress affects the body is that poorly managed stress can lead to increased fatigue, balance difficulties, sleep and eating disturbance, disturbance in elimination, cognitive difficulties, and increased pain and discomfort. Now, this is with people that don't have MS. It's with all people. But a lot of this research was done on the general population. So we can understand that if poorly managed stress can lead to these difficulties, and these are also difficulties that people can encounter when they have MS, it becomes very clear how not managing stress well can make life much more difficult with living with MS, or well-managed stress can lead to increased wellness, energy, physical comfort, and joy in life. There is research that has shown that well-managed stress leads to increased well-being. And within MS population, research suggests that the use of more adaptive coping strategies, meaning managing the stress or the stressors in your life well, may affect the relationship between stress and MS inflammation. If you remember, there's a relationship with MS and inflammation. MS inflammation is what characterizes a lot of the symptoms with MS, and more adaptive coping strategies can affect this relationship. And we will talk more about this as we go on. The role that inflammation plays, what happens with stress. But just for now, if we want to make this very simple, poorly managed stress makes living with MS harder. Having good coping strategies or managing your stress well makes living with MS a little easier. So what is stress? Stressors are those situations that increase our stress. So anything that poses a challenge or a threat to our well-being is a stressor. Even if it isn't really a challenge or a threat to our well-being, anything that we think, we perceive to be a challenge or threat to our well-being is a stressor. Some stressors are unavoidable. We live in a complicated world. There's stressors all the time. They're simply unavoidable. We pay bills, we pay taxes, we deal with relatives, and having MS, living with MS, is stressful. Having to go to doctor's appointments, having to deal with medications, or finding good professionals in your area, all of this can be stressful. These stressors are unavoidable. You can learn to minimize your stressors. You can learn which stressors can be avoided. And you can also learn about how these stressors impact your life. And this is part of what you'll be looking at in this program. So let's go to the next slide. Let's look at some possible causes of stress. Illness. Okay, wonderful. So, stress makes it more difficult to live with MS, and having MS is stressful. And it feels like maybe you can't win with this one. But it's important to know that stressors can be either physical or psychological. And we'll talk about this later. So illness is a physical stressor, meaning you catch a cold. It's a physical stressor on your body. Invasive medical procedures. They're necessary, but they can be stressors, both psychologically and physically. Dental work can be a physical stressor. We go a little bit more into some of the psychological. Difficult personal or work relationships are stressors. Poor sleep or eating habits is definitely a stressor on the body. Overstimulation or lack of stimulation, too much going on or not enough going on. Loneliness, overworking, even if what you're overworking at is not something you're being paid for. This could just be overdoing it in household things. But lack of involvement with something meaningful to you is also a possible cause of stress. Not getting enough rest, meaning not taking breaks. Now, there's a lot of information that is available to you through the National MS Society about fatigue management. And if you don't know about that, you might want to get more of that information so that you can decrease that stress, learn better fatigue or energy management. Worrying is definitely a cause of stress. Not enough or too much exercise. You need to know your body and work with someone, a physical therapist, or maybe a personal trainer that will help you learn just how much exercise your body can handle. Intense emotions are stressors. Feelings are feelings, but the intensity, the overwhelm can be overwhelming to your body sometimes. Significant life events, positive or negative, can be a cause of stress. And definitely, lack of joy or laughter in your life is a cause of stress.